We've looked at local ecosystems, global ecosystems, biomes, we've looked at tropical rainforest, and now we're going to be looking at cold environments. There are three types of cold environments: the polar and the tundra areas, which are found at the North and South Pole, and then the areas that are cold because they're high, the alpine areas. We're going to be focusing on the polar and tundra areas of the North and South Pole. Those are the areas within the Arctic Circle, which is this blue dotted line at 66.5 degrees north, and in the Antarctic Circle, which again is 66.5 degrees south, this line. Now, the polar areas within these circles are areas which remain frozen or covered with ice all the year. Now, the tundra are areas next to the polar regions where the ice melts for at least part of the year. So you'll see that the Arctic is mainly ocean, so the ice is mainly sea ice. And the problem with global warming is that less and less of this sea ice is remaining permanently frozen, so the polar regions are being lost. Now, Antarctica is mainly over land, a continent, so the ice is in the form of a massive ice sheet that covers the land, but it also extends out into the sea in winter and retreats back over land in the summer. Now, Antarctica is not owned by any country. It's ruled by something called the Antarctic Treaty, where lots of countries work together for research purposes in Antarctica. Whereas the Arctic is owned by a number of countries. How many countries can you find who own some of the Arctic? And what issues might this create? So hopefully you found 9 countries: Russia, the USA, Alaska, Canada, Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, Iceland, which is technically not in the Arctic Circle, but is certainly within the biome, Northern Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Now, I just want to point out this little island here, which actually belongs to Norway. It's a group of islands called the Svalbard, and we'll be looking at those, so you just need to know where they are. So lots of countries own parts of the Arctic, and this creates conflict because each country will have a different viewpoint about how to look after the Arctic and how to exploit the Arctic. There are opportunities for development here, and especially as the sea ice is melting, a lot more areas that used to be inaccessible are now accessible. So, for example, in northern Russia, the ice is melting and people are being able to get to the oil underneath the sea. So Russia is trying to develop the oil fields in northern Russia. And this does create some issues. This photograph was just from 3 weeks ago, beginning of June 2020, and you can see there's a huge oil spill from one of the oil reservoirs in northern Russia. And this reservoir was on permanent ice, but that ice melted more than expected, and so this oil leaked into the sea, causing huge damage. And this is a fragile ecosystem. It doesn't take much to disturb it. So we know that climate is the main thing that determines what plants and animals are found in an area. So what is the tundra climate like? I'll have a look at this climate graph from Spitsbergen in the Svalbard Islands that I just pointed out in the tundra, and write 3 or 4 sentences to describe what the climate is like. Have a look at the general pattern of temperature and precipitation. Are there any anomalies that stand out? Use data in your answer, and you can even manipulate the data to try and come up with some new data. Pause this video and have a go. So what have we discovered? Well, we've discovered there are seasons with summer and winter. We've discovered it's coldest in March at a -12 degrees and warmest in July at just 6 degrees. So the range of temperature is 18 degrees. There are only 4 months above 0 degrees C, of which 2 months are over 5 degrees C, and this is the thermal growing point. So plants generally don't grow very much beneath that figure. So it's a very short growing season. Looking at precipitation, it's marked as rainfall here. It will probably be rain and snow. If I've done a little bit of maths, the average annual rainfall adds up to 337 millimetres. That's about 1/3 of the rainfall that we get in Manchester. And the rain falls particularly in late summer, early autumn, and the highest rainfall is in August with 40 millimetres of rain or precipitation. So the general picture is of a cold, dry climate. So what's the difference between the polar and the tundra biomes? Well, have a look at these photographs because it shows it quite well. The polar regions are where there's ice permanently there. So the average monthly temperature is below 0 degrees C. It doesn't snow very much because the air is dry and falling. It's dry because very little evaporation is happening. And the snow that is there is not melting. So Antarctica, which is actually a desert because it snows so rarely, the ice accumulates, and it's been accumulating for about 800,000 years in places without melting. And because of this, there is very little vegetation. You might get a little bit of lichen on the side of an iceberg, but not much at all. And therefore you don't get many animals living there. The wildlife that is there is in the sea or living from the sea, like polar bears. You can see in the tundra, however, that there are plants growing there, but no trees. And in fact, the word tundra means treeless mountain tract in North Finnish. So why are there no trees there? Well, underneath the soil is permanently frozen, and it's only the top layers that melt in the summer. So trees just wouldn't be able to grow their roots deep enough to survive there. Any plants have shallow roots and can grow on the surface. Now have a look at the photograph again. This is the summertime and you can see how waterlogged that soil is. It's mushy, it's boggy, and the plants need to be able to withstand those kind of conditions. The plants grow very, very slowly and decomposition happens very, very slowly. So the soil has got very little organic matter in it and is very, very poor quality. So both these areas for many months of the year suffer complete darkness because they're tilted away from the sun and the sun just doesn't reach these areas. So a lot of these plants in the tundra will have to cope with complete darkness for a few months of the year. So even though in the summertime there are quite a number of animals who live here, most of them are migratory and move south in the winter and come back in the summer to survive. So the tundra has more diversity than the polar regions, but nothing like the tropical rainforest that you've been looking at. We're now going to look at how plants and animals are adapted to live in the Arctic. So first of all, I want you to think about what type of conditions will organisms need to adapt to in order to survive in cold environments. And then how might a polar bear, for example, adapt to its environment? Polar bears need to be able to survive the cold, so they have thick white fur, which insulates them, and underneath their skin they have a thick layer of fat or blubber. They also have black nose and foot pads to absorb sunshine. They need to be able to chase their prey, so they have strong legs for swimming and running. And they have large feet so they can spread their load and they don't go through the snow and the ice. So how are other plants and animals adapted? Well, you have the caribou. Now they migrate south in the worst of the winter, but they can smell lichen under the snow and they've got a special bacteria in their gut that helps them digest it. They have split hooves like a cow so they can walk on the snow, and they have a stocky body that helps them conserve heat with a short tail and ears. Penguins down in Antarctica have a tail that form a tripod so that it lets them rock back on their heels and have less of its body in contact with the ice to keep warm. It also has powerful claws on its feet so it can grip onto the snow and ice when coming out of the ocean. And as you can see in this photograph, the eggs, and then when they're hatched, the chicks sit on the parents' feet so they're kept off the ice, and then they're covered by a fold of skin to keep them warm. Moving on to plants, the bearberry survives the strong winds by growing very low and having a thick bark. It has small leathery leaves so it retains the water because there's not much available, and the hairy stems help to keep it warm in the low temperatures. It has bright red berries so they're attractive to birds and that helps distribute their seeds. Similarly, the Arctic moss also has short stems so that it's less affected by strong winds, And the stems have lots of tiny leaves on them, usually only 1 cell thick, so they can photosynthesize as much as possible in the short growing season. In fact, they grow so slowly, only 1 centimetre a year. So they store nutrients in the leaves so that as soon as spring comes, they can start making the most of the growing season, which may only be a few weeks, and survive the long winters. They can also grow under the waterlogged soils, and that will protect it from the dry winds. So to recap, work out which characteristic belongs to the tundra and which to the polar biome. If you need help, read page 78 of the textbook and have a look at these couple of videos which are also on your workbook. Check to see if you were right.